In the shadows of empires, entire cultures can vanish, their beliefs wiped out, and their voices silenced forever. This is one of those stories, a story of power, fear, and annihilation. Druidism, the mysterious and ancient spiritual order of the Celts, was once central to life across the British Isles and parts of Europe. The Druids, feared for their influence over both people and nature, were not just priests. They were healers, judges, and the keepers of a knowledge that spanned generations. But this knowledge, and the very existence of the Druids, would become a target of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen: Rome. To the Romans, Druidism was more than a religion, it was a force that needed to be extinguished. These spiritual leaders encouraged resistance to Roman rule, and as far as the empire was concerned, there was no place for rebellion under their dominion. What followed was a systematic campaign to not only destroy the Druids physically, but also erase their culture, beliefs, and very memory from history. This is the dark tale of how the Roman Empire, with all its might and brutality, set out to eliminate an entire religion. What was once a thriving spiritual system connected to the natural world would be reduced to little more than fragments of myth and legend. It's common to think of Druids as simply wild, long-haired religious types, but they went much further than simply religion. In the Celtic world, they had a unique and powerful position that transcended the role of a typical priest. They were the keepers of knowledge, the mediators of justice, the voice of the gods. Imagine them as a sort of combination of spiritual leaders, political advisors, and community judges. Their influence stretched far beyond the temples or groves where they performed rituals. Unlike the Romans, who relied on written laws and codified governance systems, the Celts passed down their knowledge by word of mouth through generations. This made the Druids not just necessary, but indispensable. Without them, the Celts risked losing their entire cultural identity. Druidic beliefs were deeply connected to nature. They revered sacred groves, rivers, and stones, and their rituals often took place in the wild, far from the confines of stone temples or organized structures. The natural world wasn't just a backdrop for their religion, it was an active, living participant in their spiritual practices. The Druids believed in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. They thought the human soul was immortal, passing from one body to the next, much like the changing seasons. It was a belief system that connected the mundane with the mystical, the human with the divine. One of the most intriguing aspects of Druidism is that it was an entirely oral tradition. The Druids didn't write down their teachings or their rituals. Everything was committed to memory, which could take up to 20 years of study to master. This made them scholars of the highest order. To become a Druid was to dedicate oneself to learning in a way that few other religious orders demanded. But their power wasn't just intellectual or spiritual. The Druids played a significant role in politics. In times of war, their influence over warriors and chieftains was immense. They could inspire soldiers to fight with unparalleled bravery, knowing that the gods were on their side. In times of peace, they acted as diplomats and negotiators, helping to maintain the fragile alliances between Celtic tribes. The Druids were also healers, using their knowledge of the natural world to create remedies from plants, herbs, and minerals. Their medical knowledge, although rooted in spirituality, had practical applications that made them essential to the well-being of their communities. They weren't just holy men, they were the glue that held Celtic society together. By the time the Roman Empire was encountered by the Druids, they had already spread their influence across much of Europe. The Celtic tribes who revered the Druids occupied vast territories from modern-day France, Gaul to the British Isles. These were not just remote, barbarian lands to the Romans. They were regions rich with resources and strategically vital for the empire's expansion. However, as Rome moved into those territories, they quickly realized they were not just facing a scattered group of tribal warriors, they were facing a united cultural and spiritual force driven by the Druids. Rome's first significant encounter with the Druids came during the Gallic Wars between 58 and 50 BCE, when Julius Caesar embarked on his campaign to conquer Gaul. Caesar, ever the military strategist and political tactician, knew that controlling the religion was not just about defeating the warriors on the battlefield. It was about breaking the spiritual backbone of the Celts, their Druidic leaders. Caesar's writings give us one of the earliest Roman accounts of the Druids, in typical Roman fashion, having a mix of admiration and demonization. He described the Druids as holding immense power over the Celtic people, but crucially, Caesar also emphasized the darker aspects of Druidic practices, focusing on what he called their barbaric rituals, including human sacrifice. This, he claimed, justified their destruction. In Caesar's eyes, the Druids were more than just religious figures. They were dangerous instigators and encouraged rebellion and resistance against Roman rule. To him, they were the architects of opposition, the spiritual leaders who held the key to uniting the Celtic tribes against Rome's imperial ambitions. As Rome's campaigns against the Celts intensified, the Druids became a prime target, primarily because Rome wasn't getting its own way. Rome came close to losing the Gaelic Wars several times, mainly due to the sheer size and tenacity of the Gaelic tribes. The Battle of Gerovia in 52 BC was one of Caesar's rare defeats. Vercingetorix, the leader of the Gaelic resistance, successfully repelled Caesar's forces during a siege, causing significant Roman casualties and forcing Caesar to retreat. This victory gave the Gaelic tribes a major morale boost and almost turned the tide of the war in their favor. Under Vercingetorix's leadership, many Gaelic tribes united in a coalition, posing a formidable challenge to Roman dominance. A united Gaul seriously threatened Rome's presence in the region, as the Gaelic tribes were numerous and adept at guerrilla-style warfare, making them difficult to subdue. And at the heart of it all were the Druids. Caesar made it clear that the Druids needed to be eliminated if Gaul was to fall entirely under Roman control. While his military forces eventually decimated the Celtic armies, his political machine worked to suppress the Druids and their influence. It wasn't just about taking control of the land, but about dismantling the culture that defined that land. For all their spiritual might, for all their influence, the Druids were up against a force unlike anything they had ever faced. Rome was not just an empire of soldiers, it was an empire of engineers, of bureaucrats, politicians, an empire that understood the importance of crushing not just armies, but ideas. The Romans knew that to control the Celts, they had to do more than win on the battlefield. They had to sever the connection between the people and their religion. If the campaign against the Druids in Gaul was brutal, the war against them in Britain would be nothing short of savagery. Under Emperor Claudius's reign, Rome's invasion of Britain began in 43 CE, but Britain presented a different challenge, unlike Gaul, where Roman power slowly took root. The Druids had deep roots in Celtic tribes there, and their influence was even stronger than it had been in Gaul. Wales in particular was pivotal in Druidic power and served as a center of worship and learning. At the heart of Druidic Britain lay Anglesey, a small island off the coast of Wales. To the Celts, Anglesey wasn't just a place, it was a spiritual fortress. It was said to be the center of Druidic knowledge, where the most powerful Druids gathered to perform rituals and train the next generation of leaders. The island was home to numerous sacred groves, where the Druids believed they could communicate with the gods and harness the power of nature itself. To the Romans, this was a dangerous symbol of resistance, and it just had to be destroyed. In 60 CE, Roman forces under Gaius Suetonius Paulinus launched a full-scale assault of Anglesey. The Menai Strait, that narrow body of water separating the island from the mainland, stood between the Romans and the Druids' last stronghold. According to Tacitus, one of Rome's most famous historians, the scene on Anglesey was a terrifying spectacle. The Druids stood on the shore, dressed in long black robes, raising their hands to the sky and chanting curses as the Roman soldiers approached. Behind them were women with wild hair, carrying torches, screaming in what Tacitus described as a nightmarish display. The sight was so unnerving that for a moment, the Roman soldiers hesitated. But Roman discipline quickly reasserted itself. The legionaries pressed forward, cutting down anyone in their path. The battle that followed was swift and it was brutal. The groves, the heart of Druidic worship, were burned to the ground. The Roman soldiers showed no mercy, slaughtering Druids and warriors alike. But the destruction of Anglesey was more than just a military victory. It was a psychological blow to the Celts. With their spiritual leaders dead, their sacred places turned to ash, and their religious practices outlawed, the Celts found themselves cut off from the very things that had united them for centuries. Yet despite the carnage, some Druids managed to escape. It's believed that a few fled to Ireland, where Druidic practices continued secretly for several centuries. Others went underground, practicing their rituals away from the prying eyes of Roman officials. But Druidism, as a unified, organized religion, had been dealt a fatal blow. The Romans had not only destroyed its physical presence, they had ripped out its heart. The Romans weren't just masters of military conquest, but also experts in the art of propaganda. Once they had begun dismantling Druidism, they didn't stop at physically eradicating the Druids in their sacred sites. They needed to justify their actions to the Roman public and the newly conquered Celtic people. And they did this by crafting a narrative that painted the Druids as dangerous, barbaric, and inhumane. Julius Caesar had already laid the groundwork for this. According to him, the Druids routinely sacrificed criminals and prisoners of war by burning them alive in massive wicker men, giant human-shaped structures filled with people set ablaze as offerings to the gods. The image of the wicker man has since become one of the most enduring symbols of Druidism in popular culture. But how much of it is true? Historians still debate whether such practices actually occurred or if Roman writers exaggerated them to justify their brutal campaign against the Celts. After all, it's easier to gain public support for destroying an enemy if that enemy is perceived as monstrous. The truth may lie somewhere in between. While it's likely that the Druids did practice sacrificial rituals, especially during times of war, it's doubtful that human sacrifice was as common or as grotesque as the Romans described. However, to Caesar and later Roman leaders, the image of bloodthirsty Druids helped reinforce the narrative that the Celts needed to be civilized by Roman rule. The demonization of the Druids wasn't just for the benefit of Roman citizens, it was also a psychological weapon used to break the spirit of the Celtic people. By portraying their spiritual leaders as savage and inhumane, Rome sought to sever the connection between the Celts and their religion. If the Druids could be shown as unworthy of reverence, then the Celts might be more willing to accept Roman rule and adopt Roman customs. The Roman authorities also banned Druidic practices, making performing Druidic rites of worship in sacred groves illegal. It was a multi-pronged approach, and one that worked perfectly. By the end of the 1st century CE, Druidism as a formal organized religion had been all but destroyed. The Roman Empire's systematic campaign to eradicate the Druids had succeeded in wiping out their leadership, their sacred sites, and much of their cultural influence. But the final blow to Druidism came not just from the sword, but from the Romanization of Celtic society. Over time, as Roman infrastructure, governance, and culture took hold in Britain and Gaul, the Celts began to adopt Roman customs. They embraced Roman laws, Roman roads, and eventually Roman religion. The spread of Roman gods gradually filled the spiritual vacuum left by the destruction of the Druids, which was later replaced by blossoming Christianity. Once united in their opposition to the Druids, the Celts found themselves increasingly integrated into the Roman Empire. Roman temples began to replace Druidic groves, and Latin replaced Celtic languages in official and religious contexts. As the memory of the Druids faded, so too did the resistance they had inspired. But not everything was lost. Ireland, untouched by Roman conquest, became a refuge for Druidic practices. While Druidism in Ireland was not identical to what had existed in Britain and Gaul, it retained many of the same spiritual elements. The Druids continued to serve as spiritual leaders, healers, and judges in Irish society, and the oral traditions survived for centuries after their destruction elsewhere. Even in regions conquered by Rome, elements of Druidism survived in the form of folklore and mythology. The Celtic revival of the 19th century, for example, romanticized the Druids as mythical figures, imbuing them with a sense of lost wisdom and spiritual power. The idea of the Druid as a wise, nature-connected mystic has since become a fixture in literature and popular culture. But make no mistake, Rome's destruction of Druidism nearly 2,000 years ago was about as comprehensive and as savage as you are ever going to find. Once the heart of Celtic society, the Druids were torn from their people, their traditions scattered to the wind. The deliberate dismantling of Druidism wasn't just about ending a religion, it was about controlling a population by erasing their beliefs, leaders, and sense of identity. It was a calculated, brutal strategy, one that worked exactly as hoped. With the Druids gone, the Celts became easier to govern, and the Romanization of their lands continued unchecked. However, in destroying the Druids, Rome also destroyed something far deeper, a connection between the people and the land, a tradition of oral wisdom that can never truly be recovered. What remains of Druidism today are fragments, myths, legends, and romanticized images of a lost spiritual world. The Druids, once the powerful intermediaries between humans and the divine, became nothing more than a memory, their knowledge erased by the flames of empire.